Hello, everyone, and welcome to the sixth session of URGE. It's so good to have you here with us for the Diversity and Inclusivity session. My name is Stephanie Madsen. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and part of the URGE planning team. I live and work on Wampanoag Nation lands. We have 3 engaging speakers scheduled for tonight, followed by our inclusivity tip, and time for Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentations, please put them in the Q&A box. We'll get to as many as possible at the end of the program. Let's dive in. The first speaker is Dr. Bala Chaudhry. Dr. Chaudhry is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Studies at DePaul University. Her research examines plant-soil microbe interactions with a focus on mycorrhizal fungi to address landscape scale questions in natural and managed ecosystems. She uses a variety of scientific approaches, from continent scale macroecological studies to small scale laboratory experiments to big data synthesis. In 2020, Dr. Chaudhry received the Early Career Motivator Award by the Association for Women in Science Chicago and the Women of Spirit and Action Award for her work on promoting anti-racism in STEM. She has over 30 peer-reviewed publications, and in 2019 was awarded a National Science Foundation Career Award to study fungal dispersal, as well as ways to promote racial equity in the environmental sciences. Dr. Chaudhry will give a presentation discussion on her paper, 10 Simple Rules for Building an Anti-Racist Lab, and how we can start implementing anti-racist strategies and policies in our lab to create a more inclusive environment. Welcome, Dr. Chaudhry.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to all of the URGE organizers for inviting me to this session today. I'm coming to you today from the traditional lands of the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Mascoutane people, and also we're roughly 75,000 Native Americans from 150 different tribes currently reside in what we now call Chicago. Next slide, please. For today's session, you all read our paper on building an anti-racist lab. I want to begin by acknowledging my co-author, Dr. Esmeret Assefa-Berhe, who is a professor and soil biogeochemist at UC Merced and a real leader in STEM equity. Together, we wrote a paper called 10 Simple Rules for Building an Anti-Racist Lab, which is now published in PLOS Computational Biology as part of their 10 Simple Rules series. Of course, there are more than 10 steps to this work, and not all will be simple, but the goal was to write a piece summarizing ideas on what we as research scientists, leaders, primary investigators can do to work toward anti-racism in our labs. This past year, scientists have been increasingly in search of anti-racism action plans, so there was a need for clear, actionable steps that PIs could take to build a lab environment that fosters a more racially inclusive environment. So today I'll talk a little bit about some motivation for the paper as it pertains to the environmental sciences and talk about some implementation techniques, particularly relating to inclusion and belonging. Next slide. But before we talk about anti-racism in STEM labs, I want to point out that I'm not a STEM equity scholar. I'm a scientist. It's common that minoritized scientists are asked to speak on their DEI work, but not necessarily their science. So I just wanted to take a moment to highlight some just images from my lab website, and how in the introduction you heard about how we study plant soil microbial ecology, and we do this using large scale experiments and synthesis, et cetera. I just wanted to briefly mention that that's the major biophysical science focus of my lab. Next slide. My lab is also funded to conduct research aimed at broadening participation of underrepresented groups in STEM. And since about 2015, I've been collaborating with a social scientist, Dr. Tanya Schussler, who together we're working to study the experiences of students of color in the environmental sciences. Next slide. And a lot of this is motivated by the fact that as a faculty of color, students of color come to me expressing the trouble that they have with the lack of representation of people of color in our curriculum, in the classrooms, and in what the image of what an environmental scientist is portrayed to look like. And this is despite many examples of global leaders, environmental change makers, that are coming from communities of color, as well as research that has really debunked the deficit model of explaining the lack of students of color in the field. So we conducted interviews and focus groups to understand student motivations for getting into the environmental sciences, supports, impediments that may have affected their success in the program, and then also what changes they might recommend to improve inclusion in the department. Next slide. So the responses to the interviews really floored us. There were many, many moving, telling quotes summarized in a paper that we have in review right now, but they revealed really unique motivations for entering the field that revolve around a desire for social and ecological well-being. So I'll just read a couple of these. The lack of diversity doesn't allow for these kinds of conversations to be had. People will talk about polar bears dying before they talk about brown people breathing in dangerous air. And they also reflected students' perceptions of a really limited perspective in the program that reflects white environmentalism. So one student said, "I didn't feel I had a place. I always was the one pointing out stuff in classes that's racist, and the professors just didn't know how to maneuver it." So these interviews were motivating our work. Next slide. But the racial uprisings of May 2020 in response to the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor really called new attention for the need for anti-racism in STEM. And as scientists began to learn about anti-racism and search for plans of action, we, as Merritt and I, were reminded of the harmful mistakes that many scientists sometimes make as beginners to discussions of race. So they include questioning the instrumental value of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in STEM, which can be objectifying. People of color don't need to serve a function. They simply deserve to be in science spaces. Confusing race as a biological entity, arguing that since there's no genetic determination of race, there's no racism. Arguing that the unbiased nature of science and scientists precludes racial biases in STEM, which is just not true. See data on racial bias in funding, hiring, name discrimination, et cetera. And then hijacking discussions of race with anecdotes from other types of discrimination without employing an intersectional framework. So the sexism or the classism that you experience is not the same or equal to racist encounters, and nor the solution. Next slide. So these mistakes are not only counterproductive, but they've been shown to cause anxiety and burnout for people of color working toward racial and ethnic equity. Next slide. Another common mistake is taking a not racist approach as opposed to an anti-racist approach. And anti-racism, it's not new or controversial. It simply encourages beliefs, actions, or policies that promote the idea that people of different races and ethnicities are equal. and just excellent scholarship around anti-racism that's really risen to popularity in the last year or so. Next slide. So why focus on labs? We know that racism is pervasive in much larger organizational scales, and from institutions to our science societies, to the rules and the structures that determine success and longevity in science careers. The reason for focusing on the lab is because the lab is our scientific home. It's where most of our daily science interactions take place. It's really the front lines of where either inclusion and belonging are fostered, or exclusion and isolation push Black, Indigenous, and people of color out of science. And if you want to borrow from really the excellent work happening on racial justice movements and communities, really the bottom line is, how can you expect to scale up and fix systems if you don't have your house in order? So next slide. So I'm going to just highlight 4 of the rules. And the first is to talk about it. So lab PIs set the culture and the agenda for the lab, whether it's intentional or not. And so discussing race is important to signal to lab members that they can come to you if they face racism or other racially motivated transgressions. So discussions can be structured around journal club readings of peer-reviewed literature, invited DEI speakers, brainstorming sessions on developing anti-racist lab policies, and many of the excellent papers that are featured in the URGE reading series as well. Next slide. The rule 2 I want to highlight calls for addressing racism in lab and field safety guidelines. I know another speaker is going to talk about field work as well, but I wanted to highlight it also because it's probably the most urgent rule because racist violence threatens the safety of our lab members right now. And Black and brown people are particularly targeted. They may be harassed by campus security or others who think they don't belong. And it's really the PI's responsibility to provide safety nets and additional supports to Black, Indigenous, and people of color to ensure safety in science spaces. Next slide. I wanted to highlight Rule 4 because it involves examining labs' mentoring practices. More and more, this one-to-one hierarchical mentor model is being abandoned for multi-mentor systems. Multi-mentor systems come in lots of different flavors, including group-based mentoring, network mentoring, nested mentoring. There's really excellent scholarship around multi-mentor systems that's worth checking out. And these support systems help buffer against mentor-mentee relationships that may fail due to racial biases, conscious or unconscious. On the right side is something called a mentor map that's worth checking out as a system to identify multiple mentors for different mentoring needs. Next slide. I just, one more click ahead, thanks. I just wanted to bring to attention Rule 6 because we're talking about inclusion, and I wanted to highlight how the connection, the community is so important to inclusion and belonging that we really need to support Black, Indigenous, and people of color in their efforts to self-organize and form identity affinity groups. And these organizations are just really crucial to combating feelings of exclusion and isolation that drive folks to leave the field. And they can be through professional societies like SACNAS, through universities. So for example, we have an Asian American affinity group that I'm a part of. And it was a big draw for me to join my current institution. And I also wanted to just highlight these organizations can be less formal as well. So last year I started Women of Color in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, which is an online community for women and non-binary scientists who work in the field as a way to connect and improve science networks and thus science success. Next slide. And I'll just end with 3 take-home messages for this journey, because it is a journey of anti-racist introspection and action. First, despite the title of this talk, building an anti-racist lab won't be easy, but there are steps that do exist for groups that want to take action. Second, PIs and lab heads are uniquely positioned to step up and be leaders in anti-racist STEM action. And third, the work in our labs, in our science homes can begin today. We don't need additional committees or surveys to engage in the work. Thank you. Oh, I have to thank my lab, who's always willing to talk about anti-racism, and also, of course, my collaborators and my funders. Thanks.
Oh, Stephanie, you're muted.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Chaudhry. I especially liked your quote, how do you fix systems if you don't have your house in order? I really, really like that one. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Nia Morales. Dr. Morales is the Assistant Professor of Human Dimensions of Wildlife in the University of Florida's Wildlife Ecology and Conservation Department, where her teaching and research generally focus on the role of social science in the conservation of fish and wildlife. She also focuses on studies related to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in conservation and outdoor recreation. Dr. Morales will give her presentation discussion on promoting inclusion in ecological field experiences, examining and overcoming barriers to a professional rite of passage, and how geoscience labs and departments can evaluate and improve current field practices and how they can be more inclusive. Welcome, Dr. Morales.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited. This is such a large audience. I don't know that I've done a Zoom meeting with over 500 people before. It's exciting. So I'm going to wait for that PowerPoint to come up. Perfect. Thank you. So my work primarily is in conservation and ecology. But for this paper, I worked with UFERN, which is the Undergraduate Field Experiences Network. And this is an NSF-supported network that's pretty much geared to creating inclusive field experiences. So we get together every year and we have many people who are part of the network to talk about different strategies that we can employ to make sure that field experiences are equitable and inclusive. So field experiences help to give networking skills, experience, peer-to-peer relationships, and a sense of adventure. Next slide. Internships are a distinct type of experience, but my research primarily dealt with internship programs. So some of the data that is out there says that employers place more weight on experiences, particularly internships and student work, than on GPA and major. Internships are often the single most important credential for recent grads in all sectors, regardless of whether it's conservation, ecology, it could be business, it could be health. In ecology and geosciences, employers typically expect field experiences as they illustrate proficiency with skills and techniques. Next slide, please. According to one study, but there are several out there that offer other evidence, retention is really the bigger issue than recruitment. And this is what drives disparities in representation. Represented students are less likely to enroll in field courses and field studies. And field courses and studies were associated with higher self-efficacy gains, higher college graduation rates, higher retention in a major, and higher GPAs at graduation. Next slide. So the rest of the presentation is based on some informal discussions with folks in the UFERN network, as well as interns during my dissertation studies. And my dissertation focused on barriers and opportunities to minorities in conservation careers. Next slide, please. There's been a lot of research on the barriers to participating in internships. However, retention is a really big issue in conservation careers. Marginalized students who do participate in internships often experience a lot of issues that might turn them off of the field. And Zavaleta, Beltran, and Borker had a really nice image here that I decided to share that talks about some of the common barriers, including financial, lack of information knowledge, opportunity, feelings of isolation or not fitting in, and commitments with family and community. Next slide, please. But what I wanted to talk about is the actual reality of the field experience. So the field experience itself can pose challenges and barriers to students from marginalized groups. And many of these challenges are mentioned in that ESA paper. But a lot of, like I said before, a lot of this was based off of conversations, more anecdotal evidence with interns and folks in the field. Next slide, please. So one of the big barriers to field experiences for people who are actually doing them is that for many students, this is the first time that they're in remote locations without access to comforts or familiar sites. Some interns and field students had never been camping before, let alone outside of their suburban or urban neighborhoods. Many are nervous about being in remote locations and concerned about the nature of the actual field techniques. Next slide, please. Oftentimes, unless the program is primarily focused on minorities, and sometimes even when they are focused on minorities, students of color are often the only person of color in the area. And they could even be the only person of color in the geographic region if it's a particularly remote area or a particularly rural area. This can lead to feelings of isolation and an inability to connect with peers, mentors, and others they might encounter during their internships or field experiences. Peers and supervisors may also lack cultural competency to interact with people from various backgrounds that are different from theirs. Another common challenge that has been noted is that students feel like they don't fit the model. So they don't feel like they represent the image of what a field biologist or geoscientist looks like. And often will experience microaggressions that come in many forms. Next slide, please. One of those could be the feelings of isolation because you don't necessarily adhere to the sort of idea of being a gritty outdoors person. I've had multiple students who have mentioned to me the feeling of being isolated for their desire to keep clean during field experiences, where others wore their dirt as a badge of honor and treated them like outsiders or not real biologists. Next slide, please. Another barrier is the challenge of finding ethnic hair care products, which may seem simple to some, but the student in particular that mentioned this to me, she also mentioned that her mentors suggested they just use quote unquote normal shampoo, which was a microaggression, and it also showed her that her mentor didn't really care about her specific needs. And she was made to feel different about her specific needs and that they were not important. Next slide, please. Apart from food, from food, you can tell it's dinner time. Apart from inability to access certain cultural or ethnic related resources, there are also religious traditions that could impact interns and field students' experiences. One student that I worked with during my dissertation mentioned that she struggled with fieldwork during Ramadan, where she couldn't eat or drink until sunset and felt her supervisors did little to understand her practices and accommodate for them. Next slide, please. And some of these challenges may also relate to accessibility. There are several geoscience and ecology students who are differently abled or have cognitive or physical disabilities. These students may be disregarded, physically left behind, or isolated from activities due to their disabilities. Next slide, please. So what do we do about it? How do we build an inclusive experience? One step is to help students feel more comfortable with their experience. Don't underestimate the impact of your own statements if you're a supervisor or a mentor. Just because you don't think it's a big deal doesn't mean that they don't. I think that being felt heard is very important. So don't further marginalize a student just because it's not an issue that you face. Next slide, please. Building cultural competency is also really important. And this is the ability to understand, communicate, and effectively interact with people from different cultures and backgrounds. Cultural competence includes being aware of your own worldview and developing positive attitudes towards other cultural differences. Next slide, please. And then helping make it the most for students. We have this traditional sort of idea that a field experience, whether in the geosciences or in ecology, has to be in some remote location. Field experiences do not have to be conducted in remote wilderness areas and don't necessarily require students to be able-bodied. Reframing these existing locations, perhaps using urban ecology and understanding place-based issues that benefit local communities can create a more robust experience. And rethinking the residential format, this can be a challenge for many students. For students who have cognitive or physical disabilities, employing universal design tactics for accessibility will also help. A note on the place-based issues and wilderness. I think it's also important to understand that the concept of wilderness is a very Eurocentric concept. And so other cultures and other ethnicities don't view wilderness, they may not view wilderness the same way at all as what Western science views it. Creating those different frameworks into designing projects and designing experiences can be much more inclusive than not. Next slide. Again, broadening the definition of the field. You don't need to be in the wilderness to have an authentic field experiences. You don't need to be able-bodied to participate, and there are opportunities for discovery all around us. I never did a formal field study, but I've been involved in lots of projects involving the outdoors in more urban and suburban settings, and I consider those experiences field experiences. I think that in the past, I probably would have thought a little bit less of these experiences because they weren't out in Yellowstone or out in some very iconic place. But this helps to broaden the model of who is a blankologist, a biologist, a geologist, and then what they look like, where they come from, and what they do. Last slide, please. So overall, I think as we move forward, inclusion in ecology requires us to understand the constraints to inclusivity and taking a hard look at our existing structures. It's not that people of color and students of color don't want these experiences, it's that they're often left out. And the ones who do experience them can also be marginalized in those experiences. So as we move towards the future, we need field experiences that are dynamic, place-based and community-focused, culturally sensitive and relevant, and equitable. And with that, I will wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Morales. Really, really great suggestions when we're orchestrating field work. Thank you so much. So let's introduce our third speaker, Dr. Maricela Martinez-Cola. Dr. Martinez-Cola joined Utah State University in the fall of 2018 after receiving her PhD from Emory University. She is also an alumna of the University of Michigan, where she majored in African American Studies and earned her law degree at Loyola University Chicago School of Law. Her research largely focuses on the critical comparative study of race, class, and gender as it relates to culture, social movements, and comparative historical sociology. She is published in the Journal of Law and Society, The Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, Teaching Sociology, Understanding and Dismantling Privilege in Humanity and Society. Dr. Martinez-Cola will give her presentation discussion on her paper, Collectors, Nightlights, and Allies, Oh My, White Mentors in the Academy, and how white mentors can oftentimes be gatekeepers to the perseverance of students of color in academia. Thank you, Dr. Martinez-Cola.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really grateful that you, that URGE has thought to use my article as some point of learning. So I really, truly appreciate that. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to first kind of discuss the genesis of the article and give a little bit more background to it. So I'm sort of assuming and hoping that a lot of you have already read it. I may end up sort of retelling some of the stories, but not necessarily all of them. Next slide, please. So I was with the Ellen Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program. This was when I was a grad student. They asked me to come and meet with the undergraduates and talk to them about my experience as a graduate student of color. And so this happens a lot, you know, because as the previous speaker said, sometimes you're the only or one of a few in there. And so this was a very rarefied space because there were lots of people of color in the room and only people of color. And so that's an opportunity to kind of really get real about our conversations. And so the students asked me, what should we look for in a mentor? And, you know, you could have sort of your basic replies, but I was feeling particularly candid that day and gave them, I think I'm hoping was a more in-depth answer. Next slide, please. So I explained to them that because there are so few of us, and I was just a grad student at the time, now as an assistant professor, tenure track assistant professor, that number gets even smaller. And I explained to them, because of that, you're not likely to encounter a BIPOC faculty that'll be able to help to kind of guide you through the process, or you may be able to have some people that'll be on your team and on your side, but may not be able to necessarily mentor you directly because they are mentoring so many other BIPOC students. Next slide, please. So, oh, next slide, please. Yeah. So when I left the meeting, after talking to them, I realized there was a gap in the literature. So there were plenty of articles that talked about, you know, how to be a good mentor, how to be a good mentee, from the experiences of white mentors and telling sort of mentees of color how to sort of respond to that. But I realized the lens had never been turned back to the mentor from the perspective from, and I'll say our collectively, what I mean by ours, BIPOC students and individuals. And the lens had never been turned to how we view our mentors. And so, you know, before I begin, everybody always asks, well, what is a mentor? And I really love Carrie Ann Rockamore's answer, because she says that if you ask 10 different faculty members what mentoring is, how it works, what it looks like, and how to tell if it's effective, you'll get 10 different answers. And mentoring can be anywhere from a once a year coffee date to a quasi-parenting lifelong relationship. Next slide, please. So I explained to the students, I said, you're going to either run into collectors and nightlights. And then later on, my colleague encouraged me to put in allies. And the students were, you know, when I started to explain what collectors are, so collectors kind of collect, quite literally collect BIPOC mentees. You know, the mentees often feel like they're on display, that they're there to sort of validate their mentors' commitment to diversity. The mentees are asked a lot to serve on diversity committees. It is as if the research and who they are as an individual that's the value that they serve and the purpose that they serve. They're often, you know, considered a representation, as I said, of the mentor's commitment to inclusion, right? And one of the things I really try to stress, because one of the students said, oh, I hate it when that happens, you know. And one of the things I really want to stress is I really truly think much of it is unintentional, that you can have a lot of very well-meaning people who are very sincere, but can sometimes be sincerely wrong in their efforts. The other thing I learned is that collectors know where the resources are. So from my sense, whenever I have a collector mentor, I usually have a quid pro quo relationship with them. Like, okay, I will serve on your panel, but when it comes time for me to get something for a student, or I need some more information on something, you're going to be there for me too. The next one was nightlights. And this actually came from a really clever student at Agnes Scott College, because I worked in multicultural affairs for years. And we were going to go buy a car. My father was going to go buy a car. And just to give you an idea, I'm a 5'1" Chicana. My father's barely maybe an inch taller than I am. And I'm married to a 6'1" Italian Irish white man. And my student said, don't forget your nightlight. And everybody started laughing at this joke that I obviously hadn't been a part of. And what she meant was to don't forget to take Greg with me, my husband with me, because he's going to get different treatment in that space than my father and I would. And sure enough, usually whenever we take him with us, they direct most of the questions to him or they'll talk to him. And so it's this idea that a nightlight understands the inherent challenges at historically white institutions or in predominantly white spaces. They're able to kind of help BIPOC mentees navigate through the unknown and unforeseeable curves. They essentially provide light in dark, unfamiliar places. And they use their privilege and social and cultural capital to help you navigate those spaces. And essentially, they basically make the invisible visible, what we call the hidden curriculum in sociology. They help make that a little bit more seen, and they serve as translators in that process of translating. Okay, what exactly just happened? I remember I used to have someone that would meet with me after meetings, like faculty meetings, and we'd kind of break down, okay, did you get that? Did you hear this part? And began to sort of develop my sort of the political nature of what it can be like. And finally, of course, you have your allies. And unfortunately, these are the ones that are the least likely to encounter. They usually make, this particular group usually makes meaningful connections without necessarily asserting equality. So they don't think necessarily that their working class or poor background is the exact equivalent of my Chicana experience, but we're able to connect on that really meaningful level. So for example, one of the allies I have grew up in Flint, Michigan. And the minute she said, I grew up in Flint, Michigan, there was just a connection because I understood what that meant. The other thing is that their actions speak louder than their words. They don't have to say anything, they just do it. The biggest one is that they can take criticism and feedback and recover very quickly. So when I have an issue or I have a problem, I can be able to talk to them immediately about it. They build trust with consistency and humility, and they push their mentees beyond their best. Next slide, please. So as I've written this, gotten feedback on this article, I've gotten 2 responses from white mentors who appreciate being able to reflect on their experience and who they are and what it is that they want to provide. And then I also hear back from people of color and BIPOC individuals who tell me that they feel seen, that this was sort of the first time anybody had articulated what their experience was and that these typologies made sense to them. Next slide, please. All right, so I created this just to be able to kind of explain that before we even get to you, mentor, right? All these different experiences have happened to shape who it is that we are, starting from my K through 12 experience, where many of us may have been singled out because we were smart or had some kind of potential. Somebody along the way saw that and started to help cultivate it. But at the same time, for every one person that saw that and cultivated, there are about 5 that didn't. And so, you really sort of end up moving along, through that process, sort of trying to gauge who's going to be on your side and who isn't. It carries on into undergraduate, where a lot of people don't understand. They'll say, oh, well, the student, doesn't seem like they're committed or seems like they're tired all the time or something to that effect. And people don't understand, for example, that some of us are working to be able to send money back home to our families. The differences that were there in K through 12 become painfully clear when you're there at an undergraduate level. I remember for myself, I didn't know that I was considered blue collar working class, right? Until that label was introduced to me when I was in college. And it was quite literally a really dumb diversity exercise where they said, if your parents make more than $250,000 a year, cross the room. And they went and they continued going down, right, of course, and everybody had crossed the room until myself and another friend named Sintwali. And I looked over at him and he was like, don't worry, girl, I got you, And they said, if your parents make more than $50,000 a year, cross the room. And I still stayed on the other side. And Sintwali just kind of looked at me like, I'm sorry. And, I said, well, yeah, my parents make $48,000 a year. And how did I know that? Because I had to fill out my FAFSA form, right? And there I was on the other side of the room and they're looking at me like, how did you get here? And sometimes a lot of the answers is, oh, wow, she's Hispanic, is usually where it ends up going. moving on, of course, to your master's or GAD, you end up, for myself, I got my JD. There's even more hoops that you need to jump through, and it feels like it's very little progress. And so all of these things have kind of shaped who you are before they even get to you. I think people forget that there's an entire life that shaped your goals and your dreams before you even get there. And so I just kind of want to have that keep in mind. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end on this slide after I go through it. But one of the things I also wanted to share was some of the stuff that we've been taught, right? I've been encouraged to turn this article into a book. And so I've been kind of writing down these different ideas that, what is it that we as people of color, as, BIPOC individuals, what have we been taught? So we've been taught, of course, that you need to work twice as hard to get half as much. They will accept mediocrity from their own, but not from you. You have to be excellent always. And one of the things that I started to kind of realize after a while is that my mediocre is somebody else's excellence, because I had been so accustomed to always being excellent. I don't know what it's like to be mediocre. The other thing is you always have to look ready, right? You can't give anyone something to say about you. So for example, just before getting ready for this talk, I went and pressed my hair, put on makeup, put on a dress. There was no way I could come to this speech casual and relaxed with a ponytail in my hair and jeans on, because I've been taught that I'm representing everyone, from my family members to my community in that place. We're taught to fix our face. So when something does happen in a meeting, or there's a microaggression that happens, you learn to fix your face very quickly. And that means that instead of sort of cocking your head over or, lifting that eyebrow, you just learn to kind of sit there with a very big poker face and maybe hopefully get a chance to talk about it after. Before you ask a question, we're taught you need to find the answer first, because you're not supposed to bother busy people. And I find that so much nowadays, now as a professor, even being on the other side, how much many of my first generation and BIPOC students are so worried about bothering me. The other thing that I learned is that when you do get into a contact and engagement, and you start to try to develop a relationship with a mentor, you ask them questions about themselves, because it's always their favorite topic. So you talk about themselves or their research, and they will feel like they've made this amazing connection with you when all you did was just ask a question about them. But they may never necessarily get to know you. The other thing is to never make them cry. Earlier, when I was talking about allies, they're able to get over things really quickly. If I were to ever try to call out a collector, or if I were to ever try to say something to a collector, they usually end up crying and getting upset and feeling like I didn't mean it, and I'm not racist. And they'll feel sort of all these really intense emotions. And now I have to spend my time soothing the person who hurt me. And so you learn very quickly that, it's just not even worth going into it at the time. The other big thing is that if anybody asks you a question, you're supposed to be careful with what you say. And you give a very measured response, because you don't know if that person is going to misunderstand what you just said and then tell 5 other people. So now there's 5 people who may have that misinformation about you. And if this seems like it's really sort of very suspicious and almost on the verge of paranoia, that's what it can feel like sometimes, that, you, especially when you're the only one and you have nobody there, that you feel like it can be in your corner. The other thing is, don't try to tell us, just tell your family that you want to ... Because that may not be our experience. I know I certainly couldn't do that. Go home and say, well, I'm going to do this and that, and I don't care what you say, because I was taught differently how to be with my family. And I think the biggest thing too is just this idea that you don't just represent yourself, you represent your family. And so when you're engaging with individuals, and I tell people, when you're engaging with me, you're engaging not just with me, but with my family, with my ancestors, with, because I feel like I have all of their hopes and dreams invested in what it is that I do. And that is a very heavy, some people think of it as a burden, but I tend to think of it as an honor to be able to do that. So I'm going to go ahead, you can go ahead and close out the PowerPoint, and I'll end at that point. Maybe we can have more of a discussion later. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All three speakers, there's so much valuable information and we can all use it to become better mentors. It's really incredible. Thank you so much. At this point, we are going to now take a break and we're going to bring you the inclusivity tip by Michael Manga, focused on nominations for awards.
Hello, my name is Michael Manga, and I'm a member of the Berkeley Urge Pod. Pronouns are him, his. And I'm a professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Science at the University of California, Berkeley. And I'm coming to you from Macone Hall on our campus, which sits on unceded and occupied land of the Ohlone people. The theme today is that individuals, groups, and initiatives cannot be recognized with awards and honors for their accomplishments if they are not nominated. And there are two topics I'd like to address. First, why do we have awards and honors? And second, what can we do as individuals and a community to promote our colleagues, their science, and to diversify those being recognized? Awards and honors celebrate scientific advances and breakthroughs. They showcase leaders. This type of recognition can be a powerful agent for change. Recognition also affects individuals. A few years ago, I was fortunate enough to be selected as a member of the National Academy of Sciences. And I've been fortunate to receive other awards and medals. And I normally just file these in a drawer because they're not the reason I pursue a career in science and education. This time my father asked for a copy of the certificate so he could send it to our family members in South Africa. And this is a reminder that awards are for others too. My grandmother never got to go to school. My grandfather attended school for less than 2 years. And so for my South African family, the National Academy of Sciences is a sign of success and something they celebrated. And for me, it was a reminder of the social and economic mobility that our universities can provide. Awards and honors are for individuals, their family, their collaborators, and for institutions to promote the success of their members. Awards and honors advance science by providing an opportunity to share and promote science through the media. So what can we do? It's important to acknowledge up front that promoting others can take a lot of time and effort. But hopefully it's rewarding. For example, awards based on scholarship require that you understand the significance of that scholarship, and hence provides an opportunity to learn and reflect on how a field has evolved and where it's going. Awards and honors have guidelines and deadlines, and a few words of wisdom from previous URGE interviewees are relevant once again. Learn what awards are out there and their deadlines. You don't have to lead a nomination or write a letter yourself. As our first interviewee, Vernon Morris, said, ask the most senior people in your department. He called out National Academy members and asked them to support your efforts. Ask those who have the most experience and relevant perspectives. Your organization may also have an awards and honors committee. In my own department, our committee exists to ensure that none of our colleagues are being overlooked because they don't have the most proactive friends or community. And we systematically discuss every member of the department, and we strategize on how to enable nominations. Nomination packages typically contain a CV and supporting letters. Both are worth commenting on. To the extent possible, I prefer not letting people know they're being nominated. Why? This way, if they're not selected, there's no disappointment. Awards and honors are really about celebrating accomplishment, not about rejection. In my own department, I try and collect CVs from everyone once or twice per year so that we have them handy. We also want effective letters. Letters don't need to repeat what's in a CV. Facts like education, number of papers, or metrics like H indices. Effective letters instead provide an assessment and context that is above and beyond a list of papers and a biography. Good letter writers will know the field and have some perspective that they can bring to bear. And a diversity of those perspectives, so institutions, nationality, gender, ethnicity can only help. Letters should also pay attention to the criteria for an award, and these evolve over time. For example, the AGU McElwain Medal now is for depth and breadth of research, impact, creativity, as well as service outreach and diversity. Last, Sarah Aarons mentioned when working with Indigenous communities, don't wait until the last minute. Here it takes time to write letters and to do the homework that is often necessary. So to recap, awards and honors are a chance to showcase our science and to recognize those who played a role in advancing our missions. They're valued by individuals who receive them, their colleagues, our institutions, and society more generally. We all have a role to play in helping to diversify those being recognized. If we want a diverse group of awardees, we need to make sure they're being nominated. And while most nominations will not be successful, our colleagues and their efforts can't be recognized if we don't nominate them. Thanks so much for giving me a chance to talk with you today.
All right, great. Now we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. We'll get to as many as possible. We may extend the program 10 to 15 extra minutes, depending on the discussion. So we'd love to start with our first question. It's geared towards Dr. Chaudhry, but all speakers can respond. The person asking the question said, you talked a lot about the immense power that PIs have in creating anti-racist labs. As a current graduate student, what can I do to build an anti-racist lab group from the bottom up? And how can I effectively encourage my advisor to do this work from top down and implement some of the 10 steps from your paper?
That's a good question. And it's a question that I get from a lot of trainees, so I appreciate the question. We very purposefully wrote our paper speaking to PIs and scientists who are leaders and whose job it is actually to affect change within our institutions. And it's partly in response to the fact that you see quite a lot of DEI efforts these days led by students and trainees. And then that, and in particular, students of color, while their white colleagues are writing papers and grants. And this then leads to, those fewer metrics that lead to success and longevity in science. And so, we very purposefully we're targeting this at PIs because the students need to get a degree. Students need to line up, spend time doing the work that they're then evaluated for in jobs and promotion. Now, that said, DEI work is becoming so central to science, and you have to submit your diversity statement when you apply for jobs. And so zero experience and knowledge in this realm doesn't serve students well either. And so I think that student interest in engaging in DEI and justice issues is important, but you have to remember your primary goal. And that's why I think we start with Rule 1. I think a great place for students to start, especially if they suspect resistance from a PI, is to suggest papers to read for Journal Club. It's a softball move. It's a low stakes move. We all sit around and read papers together. And so we can start thinking about these issues through our readings that we do as a community together.
Your thoughts, Dr. Morales, on that? Did you want to contribute anything? Or?
Can we repeat the original question?
Sure. This from the perspective of a graduate student, what can they do to help build an anti-racist lab group from the bottom up? And how can they effectively encourage an advisor to do the work from the top down to implement some of those rules to help make it more inclusive anti-racist lab?
I think that one's kind of difficult, especially coming from, I am only 8 months into my initial job as an assistant professor. So this is something that I'm definitely trying to figure out where my place is and where my students' place is. I know from my own perspective, I try as the professor and the mentor to be very open and encourage people to understand our own humanity. And I think a lot of times in the sciences specifically, we take humanity out of it, but we need to realize that we are all fully formed human beings that are very complex. And that if a student has an issue, that I need to be open and available to them. Now, how I deal with burnout, I'm not sure. I haven't gotten there yet. So I don't know that I'm
time.
Yeah. So I don't know that I have a very good practical tip for that because I am so new in this position.
Okay. Dr. Martinez-Cola, did you want to add anything, or I'm happy to move on to the next question?
Yeah, you can go ahead and move on to the next question.
Okay, it's another one from a graduate student perspective. As a graduate student, how can I convince white faculty members to improve their cultural competency, e.g. stop tokenizing BIPOC or other marginalized students? We're paralyzed by the fact that any complaint would immediately single out specific students.
I'll go ahead and take that one first if you'd like. That happens so much, right? And it starts almost from the very beginning. One of the things that I didn't learn how to do, and that I'm hoping to share with you all now, is this idea that everybody said, you can say no. When somebody asks you to do X, Y, Z, they say that all the time. You can say no. But it was really interesting because nobody ever taught me how to say no, right? And so one of the first things I want to share is that it's not your job to educate this white faculty anymore. Their job is to educate you on what it is and the tools that you need to be able to get out of there, right? That's it's hard because I know that we want to try to implement so much change, but if you're there for anywhere from 3 to 5 years, you have 3 to 5 years. And trust me, there has been an entire institution that has been built before you got there that is going to keep continuing after you leave. And so I really, as a grad student, look forward to when I had my own classroom, when I had my own research opportunities. And then that's when I would be able to really put my imprint on it. And so when they ask you and when they do try to sort of tokenize you and say, oh, can you sit on this? One of the things that you can say is, let me get back to you. I never heard that phrase, let me get back to you before. Let me look at my calendar and I'll get back to you. I'm really very busy on such and such project, but let me go see and I promise I'll get back to you. Or you tell them what you're already doing. So, okay, well, I'm on this committee and I'm on that committee and I'm doing X, Y, and Z, but I'm not available right now. But if you still need me in March, then I can be there for you, right? Because usually you don't even get to that part because by the time you're telling them everything that you're doing, they're going to back up and say, oh, okay, never mind then. Because now they know that you're the one that's busy. Sorry about that, my dog. You're the one that's busy. So I never want to quash graduate students' enthusiasm for change, right? But I also don't want you to expend unnecessary energy for something that's just not going to change. And this is where you really find your allies. They're also called accomplices and co-conspirators, right? And you can go and vent in their office and get advice from them about what it is that can be done, or maybe they, particularly their white colleague, can go and talk to their colleague. There are times when I have to tell people, you need to go handle your friend because this is what is going on. And I need you to go handle your friend because it's not my job. I don't want to do this right now. I need to graduate or I need to finish this paper or I need to, those sorts of things. So I'll share that.
I think also if you are the one who's struggling with being tokenized, but you don't know how to bring it up to somebody, that's also where the value, like Dr. Chowdhury mentioned, of being in affinity groups. You may not have a person physically in your lab that you can relate to, but nowadays with the connections that we can have through social media, I think it's very important to find that community. And those people can offer you, solace if at minimum, but they probably also have people who know how to navigate these situations and can give you tips.
I'll just add one thing. My approach in this work, which is that I always try to remind myself, it's not my job to convince the unwilling. It's my job to activate the willing. And this year, there are many, many willing people that deserve our attention, that actually deserve our attention. And there's enough work to do just with that.
Great, thank you. Good suggestions for sure. The next question, Dr. Martinez-Cola, the types of mentors is very interesting, but what is the take-home message for either BIPOC early career researchers or potential white mentors? If allies are so rare, should the ERC or early career researchers be very cautious about all potential mentors that are not also BIPOC?
First, thank you. I'm glad that you find the typologies interesting. I should also make clear, by the way, that one person's nightlight may be another person's ally. These are not sort of static categories that are completely and clearly defined. And I'm working on, being able to make that a little bit clearer, but it kind of changes, right, depending on the circumstances. So for early career scholars, of which I am, because I'm just finished my third year at Utah State University, one of the things I've learned is to really build my beloved community, to have a deep bench, if that makes any sense. So it's not just sort of the individuals that are sort of directly above me, but then to get people that are outside of my department also on my side, right? And particularly the ones that are tenured. And what happens is that the first person you connect with, they'll be able to tell you whether that next person is okay, right? They'll be able to kind of give you the background on that individual. So it takes a lot of research and effort to find those people. But once you build your beloved community at your institution and outside of your institution as well, they don't have to be, trust me, they're not all at Utah State. I have colleagues at Morehouse College and UNC and just all over the, University of Florida. I have a wonderful colleague there named, who helps me tremendously and is somebody that I can be able to go and talk to. And yeah, they are definitely rare. And should you be cautious? I always like to say, until they can show you, because this is about trust, until they have really earned your trust and built that's that, that they've earned it, earned your trust and your respect. Just be able to sort of, I always tell people, when you find out who they are, you know where to put them, right, in your life. And these are the opportunities to really get a chance to just figure out where to put certain mentors in your life. And they're going to all serve different purposes. There are some people that'll help you get ready to negotiate a salary. There'll be some people that'll really be able to look over your grants for you. And as you sort of suss those individuals out, you'll know what you can and cannot talk to them about. A lot of times, sometimes the white mentors that are not necessarily accomplices or allies or co-conspirators, they want to feel good about themselves being your mentor. And if that's the case and you get that sense, just, really trust your instincts. I would always tell people, I'm not a very savvy person, but I can read things really well. I can read feelings and energy really, really well. And so just kind of trust that and until they earn it. You're worth it. It is a lot of work to be a really good ally. It's a lot of work. But if you just remember you're completely and utterly worth it, then I think that's one of the things we have to try to remember about ourselves. I just tell a really quick story. I used to go, when I was at Michigan, I used to walk around like, oh my goodness, I'm so lucky to be here. It's amazing. And I'm so grateful they accepted me. And one of my mentors, a woman of color, Black woman, I love her to death. And she said, Marisela, you need to stop walking around here like Michigan did you a favor. You did Michigan a favor. Where else were you accepted? And I started to list all the other places I was accepted. She goes, you make Michigan a better place, and that is the kind of stuff that I needed. That's the stuff that filled my soul. So the people that take away your energy, it's okay to step back. It's not your job to make them feel good about themselves, Thank you.
Yeah, what a difference an amazing mentor makes. I mean, for anyone who's had the privilege of experiencing it, it's really profound. Just curious if anyone else, any of the other speakers wanted to chime in. Let's see. Here's a question. Dr. Chaudhry mentioned racism from people outside of the lab. For example, campus security. What best practices are there to address, prepare for, or mitigate racism that might be encountered at the remote field sites from people external to the field team?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's particularly important when you have lab members that need to access science spaces outside of normal business hours, coming into the lab at night, coming into the greenhouse at night. And so PIs, I think, can reach out proactively and say, listen, can we have a meeting? Because you need to know that my lab members all access these spaces after hours. Often campus security doesn't even know that. And so just reaching out proactively and alerting people. In the field, it can involve very obvious safety gear, bright vests, cones, badges. Oftentimes, things that look official. So I always get stopped when I fly with samples. And so I had a mentor that said, listen, you need all the official looking permits and, make a list that looks really official, and make sure it's typed out so that you just sort of like signals of professionalism that can help. And then lastly, if I think PI should consider, or I should say, should reconsider sending lab members to places that they know are unsafe.
That's a really good point. Right, Dr. Martinez-Cola, would you say we would, let me see, what would you say we should do to try to dispel your "we've been taught" list? If so, how do we break that habit? As a BIPOC faculty, I still feel that I need to work double what my colleagues do to get the same credit. And then when I can't do double the work, I feel like I'm not good enough. And likewise, am I modeling the wrong thing to my students by doing that?
That's such a important question. Thank you for asking it. So the what we've been taught list, and again, I'm kind of working through that because it's going to be sort of part of the book that I'm looking at. A lot of that was very valuable. That was meant to be wisdom from the people who have come before us. And made their way. And yeah, I'm pretty much convinced that I will always have to work twice as hard because, I just had somebody earlier today giving a talk and they said, when people say, oh, the system is broken. And I would say, as she said, no, the system is doing exactly what it was created to do, so it's actually working very efficiently, too efficiently, when it comes to perpetuating systemic racism and inequality, right? I think what has to happen, though, is to recognize that, as I said, your mediocre is some other people's excellence. I think what happens is we're working so hard. I've just kind of discovered this recently. I'm working my tail off, and then I can look at someone else, and they're I can tell when they send out their emails, when they turn in published reports they're about to publish. When I look at certain things, I'm like, oh my God, like I would never let some of that work go through because I've been taught, that's something that you're not supposed to do. And so I think that when you're working twice as hard, the idea is not to not feel like you're good enough. It's like, no, because I've been working twice as hard, I know I'm outstanding. A lot of times when we're doing unique work that's out there that other people haven't done, what I've realized is other people tend to make you feel like you did something wrong, when the issue is they feel insecure because you're bringing something to the table that they've never heard of before or that they never considered. And one thing that academics in general do not like is to feel stupid, right? And sometimes your work can make them feel inadequate in one way or the other. And so it's not about turning it to you anymore. You got to turn that lens back to them and say, okay, what is it about you that is so insecure and so, lacks the confidence that you are threatened by me, a graduate student, or that you're threatened by me, tenure track assistant, professor member. So it's turning the things that we've been taught into good things. They're not bad things. The stuff that we've been taught aren't bad things. So I hope that kind of helps a little bit. I had a student recently tell me, she goes, Marisela, I sit in meetings and I feel like I'm working with crayons and finger paint, and I sat there and I looked at her and I said, no, no, Miha, you're not crayons and finger paint, baby. You are a digital light show. All right. And they have never seen what you give before. They may make you feel like you're doing paints and, and if you are finger paints and, that's still the best ever, but you are a digital light show. And you are the one of a kind person that's in that space. Only you have the experience and the knowledge that you have. Start embracing that. I've realized recently I'm a double expert because I know the regular canon that everybody has taught me, although, what my colleague one time called sort of all the older white kind of men and knowledge that's been out there. And I know the research regarding, from BIPOC scholars and so on and so forth. So I'm a double expert. When you get me, you're getting two people doing this one work. So I hope that helps. Thanks.
I love that. And you're all digital light shows to me, everyone in this group and the 3 guest speakers and everybody's listening in. We have time for one more question for Dr. Morales. How do you navigate a very specific field situation, such as being out at sea for weeks or months, for example, on fishing boats? It is almost impossible to replace the work on boats with other experiences, and these environments can be unwelcoming and even unsafe for many minority groups. How do you balance cultural sensitivity with making sure that scientists get the experience?
I think that's a super important question, and I think it's very difficult. We talk about, oftentimes we talk about grit. I do think that there's a certain element of grit involved in any science endeavor, where you have to learn how to be self-sufficient. You have to learn the skills and the tools for your trade. But in order to really embrace that grit, I think that you have to have a mentor or a staff person who is open to understanding your experience. You can't be just left to flounder on your own and just say, well, this is tough, chicks, just deal with it, right? That's not appropriate. You may understand that this is a difficult place to be, and I think you should be upfront with your students about it. Say, these are difficult conditions, we're gonna be in very hot, humid weather or windy weather or wavy. I don't really go out on boats very often. But I think it really all boils down to being very open in communication with your students. You have to be able to understand when a student is looking like they're not able to handle it, and that you need to interject on their behalf and help them out. You don't have to, it's not a training wheels thing. It's really just about being open to understanding the struggles. And sometimes those struggles are not related to you being a minority or a marginalized group. It could just be because this is really hard work. And I think understanding that level of stress is really important. But yes, there are certain environments where you just have to get the field work done, and that struggle is part of the experience. But having a safe space for people to be open and communicative about that, I think is really important.
This has been great. I want to thank everyone for joining us for session 6. I especially want to thank our speakers today, Dr. Chaudhry, Dr. Morales, and Dr. Martinez-Cola. You guys are all serious inspirations to me. I loved reading your papers. I've used many of your suggestions already, and it just helps me be a better mentor, and I'm sure a lot of people listening in. So thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Have a fabulous night, and we'll see you at session 7.